Welcome to Marney Reid Presents Connect to Develop, where we provide insight from healthcare leaders on the hottest topics and trends. Hello, listeners. I am really excited not only about the topic for today, but our incredible guests who will share their experience, insight, and some pearls of wisdom about what it takes to not only go from a high-level consultant with a MedTech or a pharma company, but into that chief medical or chief innovation officer role. And even more importantly, they'll share the changes and differences that those two roles play and how to make that transition with hopefully a little bit more ease. So it's with great honor to introduce the listeners to Dr. Michael Ast, Chief of the Knee Service, Chief Innovation Officer, and Director of Ambulatory Surgery Center Strategy at Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, New York. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Marnie. Thanks for having me.
And Ann Roen, our incredible repeat guest who many of you heard talk about how to build an external and internal network on a previous podcast. Ann is the Vice President of Professional Relations and Fellows Strategy at Smith & Nephew and has decades of experience both in sales and senior leadership roles at two of the top MedTech companies in the industry. Welcome back, Ann.
Thanks, Marnie. Thanks for having me back. It's exciting.
This is going to be a good one. Okay, Ann, can you walk through high level the steps a physician would take to begin their consulting role and then work their way up the ladder to even get to the point where a company would consider asking them to come on board as chief medical or chief innovation officer?
Sure. I mean, you are right. You obviously don't go from an unknown to CMO. So I think there are a lot of steps that surgeons can take or physicians could take to begin their consulting role and work their way up. I think one of the main areas, it really all starts with your local sales team. So having a strong relationship with your local sales team will allow you to have access and gain exposure to other individuals within the organization, like marketing, medical education, clinical R&D, all the other areas within an organization that you may not have exposure to in the field. So from there, oftentimes we see individuals who start out speaking for us as faculty, whether it's a regional program, national program, and then ultimately maybe internationally for us at a Congress. We also see individuals then transition into more consultancy. They might be part of a focus group or an advisory board, like Dr. Ast is as an advisor for our organization, potentially even a design surgeon. And so having those steps and building your network within the organization is really important. And also having a strong relationship and building that strong relationship with the senior leaders, because obviously they are the individuals who are determining, what they're looking for in a CMO. Do they even need a CMO or maybe a different type of clinical leader? And so having those strong relationships and building them over the years, it's not going to happen overnight, but building those over the years is really important. And then really being able to prove that you're not only strong clinically, but also understand the business side of an organization, because that is extremely important as well. So I think that is a good way to start. You start with your sales team and you work your way through the organization.
That makes sense. And I love how you tranched out those very succinct steps. Mike, you've got to that point in your career where this type of ask has come, both from smaller startup type companies to huge companies. You've said yes to some and gracefully declined others. Can you share your journey?
I think honestly, certainly in the device world, Ann did a great job of outlining exactly what my journey looked like, starting from very early in medical education, going through to some sort of evaluation of technologies or evaluation of implants, and then on to advisory boards and design boards and things like that. So I actually think certainly in the device world, that's kind of how it works. Now, sometimes at the end of that road or along that road, there are opportunities to step off that path and say into something more related to overall innovation advisory or even into a CMO style role like some of these device companies have. But in general, that path is that path. I think sometimes what you have to realize is in some other companies, that path's not exactly the same. In these very early startups, occasionally there's no education to do and no product to sell, or no product to teach about. And so oftentimes it is a very early advisory role you get brought in with. And if your ideas are good, and again, right back to Ann's point, if your understanding or enthusiasm for the business side of it helps the people you're working with look around and say, hey, this is somebody we'd like to bring in more closely, sometimes that leads to those higher level advisor roles, those chief strategy officers, chief medical officers, chief innovation officer type roles. And in the very small companies, that's usually somebody who's been there from the beginning, shows a significant amount of energy and enthusiasm about not only the problem trying to be solved, but the business opportunity that exists in that space. And I think it's that combination of good ideas and good understanding of the problem trying to be solved and the balance of what it means to actually build a business that brings on some of those opportunities to you when you're in those smaller types or startup types or even tech type companies. Now, the last thing you mentioned that's really important and not always that simple is, well, what happens? How do you evaluate it? Like, how do you look and say, this is the company I want to say yes to, and this is the company you so politely put as to gracefully say no to? And I think that really comes down to what's your bandwidth, what's your interest. And I think really when they are recognizing your enthusiasm, you need to sit back and say, am I being enthusiastic because I want a cool opportunity, or am I being enthusiastic because this is actually something I believe in? Is this something I'm willing to spend my time working on? And then in my mind, it has to sort of follow the three rules. And Marty, you obviously know my wife well, who works with a lot of people in these areas. And the three rules kind of make sense. Rule number one, is it an interesting topic? So is this whether it's designing a new implant or launching a new startup or working on a new tech, is this something I'm genuinely interested in? Number two, is it a group of people I like to work with? So are the people around me people I want to move forward with, I want to spend a lot of time with, potentially I don't want to spend a lot of time with? And you can often refer back to the well-known business rule of the no jerks rule, or some people use more colorful language than that. But really, you don't want to be in one of these situations working with people that you don't want to be spending time with. And then the last one is there some upside to it? And the upside isn't always financial. Sometimes it's network. Sometimes it's career development. Sometimes it's simply entering a field you didn't have access to before. Maybe you were a doctor your whole life, but you really wanted to get into the finance side. So taking a role that opens up this new world of finance, that can be the return to you. But those three questions help you decide which ones should I say yes to and which ones might I want to gracefully decline.
So what I love about a lot of the key points you made, true interest. And have you ever been on the side where, multiple steps have gone through in the right way, you think you've got the right person, and it's something as key as product evaluation or even bigger product design or whatnot, and either that enthusiasm wanes or maybe people kind of misjudged what that true enthusiasm was for? From a company side, do companies ever reevaluate and maybe even pull back from that relationship or from that trajectory? How does that work?
Oh, absolutely. I think like any hire you have in an organization, it has to be a good fit. And I've had experiences with a smaller company where we basically tried out a chief medical officer as a part-time basis. So he kept his foot into his clinical practice and then worked with us as well as a small, 250 employee type organization as our clinical lead. And that was a nice way to really understand, is it going to work for both of us, for all of us, really? And that individual decided they didn't want to be in industry and went back into clinical practice full time. And so I think there are definitely, it's a culture fit. You have to have a culture fit. I love the comment you made about, the no jerk rule. It goes both ways. So you have to make sure that their ego can be checked at the door, because there are times where, they might not be the smartest person in the room, which is unusual. Or they may, their opinion may be heard, but might not necessarily, be taken down the road or act upon. And so I definitely have seen instances where it hasn't worked out, and it's no harm, no foul. You just have to make sure that you go into it, with the right exit strategy, if you would, and making sure that both the surgeon or the physician and the company leave, hopefully in good standing.
And sorry, I don't mean to cut anybody off, Marnie, if you were going to jump in, but that last thing you said is so critical. The idea of no harm, no foul. So many people on the other side, especially either young salespeople or young surgeons, are so afraid to say no. They say, if I say no, I'm never going to get asked again. I will tell you, it is way better to say no than to do a bad job, or than to not be the right fit, or to not follow through on what you're going to say. And it's very difficult for any young professional to say no, but I think all of us need to keep being reminded of, Ann, exactly what you just said, that if you politely and professionally decline an opportunity because it's simply not the right opportunity for you at that time in your life or at that point in your career, that's much, much better than taking on an opportunity you're not going to really do a good job of because it's not really what you're interested in, or something potentially you'll do a bad job in because you're not prepared or don't have the time.
Right. And this is a small industry. MedTech in general is a small industry, and people move around. Leaders move around, board of directors move around. So if you don't burn bridges early, you have opportunities down the road. I 100% agree.
From your perspective, as someone who potentially is going to hire or not hire them again later, offer an opportunity, how could they go about it to not only leave in good grace, but then also continue to keep that door open so that when either that life event settles down or there's something more applicable to their wheelhouse that makes you want to even go back to them again, if at all?
That's a good question. I would say there's a couple ways you could handle it. And not every job within organizations starts with the word chief. And so, depending on the size of the organization, the larger the company, obviously, the more opportunity. And maybe there's a different role within that organization that you could play. If it's something where you want, you have the interest, and maybe that's just maybe it's too big of a job at this time, or not what you were looking for, look and see, is there a different role within that organization that you can play that would add value and keep you in their radar? I think that's an option. And then also, if it's a matter of I want to step back and spend time with my family, you have to have a good reason. There's always going to be a good reason for them to do that. And if you keep the door open and say, I would like to maybe go back and be a consultant, or I would be happy to review XYZ strategy with you at some point, you keep the door open, maybe keep that professional LinkedIn type relationship together, get together at a conference at some point just to check in and just keep your face in the game, and maybe even provide value by being a trusted confidant. There's opportunities to just share your feelings without having to be, a full-time employee or on the payroll, that type of thing. So I think there's definitely different ways around it, but I have seen a lot of really strong physicians come into organizations in roles that don't start with the word chief, and they've been really valuable, and some have worked their way up to that role, and I think they are probably better for it.
How much experience do you need to have maybe with pharma and medtech to get your training wheels on before you can even think about leading an initiative like that for an institution?
Well, first, I would say if there's anyone out there listening to this that is thinking of doing it, you should totally do it. I mean, it's really a cool experience, a really cool idea, and it's a great way to try to harness the incredible brain power of the people within your organization to solve actual problems. Like we always say, nobody knows the problems better than the end users. And in healthcare, the end users are the people providing care to patients. And so if you're within a healthcare organization, have the opportunity to start up something on the innovation side, I would highly recommend that you do that. In terms of whether or not it's helpful to start outside, I think that's absolutely the case, right? It absolutely helps to start outside, to get experience in what it means to bring a product to market, what it means to develop a product through its life cycle, what it means to sit on the other side and see what MedTech or a device company might be thinking about what's the market for this product, what is going to go into getting this from a napkin idea to a design to an FDA approval. And so I feel very blessed that my experiences from prior work with either device companies or outside healthcare companies, or even my original private practice, all of these things really helped give me the tools necessary to feel comfortable taking on this institutional role.
Makes sense. And I was having a conversation with a friend who was put in charge of onboarding a new chief medical officer for a company. And not only was this new to my friend, but for the physician who, quite frankly, had been a very successful and high level consultant for them for years. It was a big adjustment and new to that person too. And so, we were having this talk about, how is that person doing? And there was a lot of hard lesson learned. And quite frankly, they went from being, kind of friendly to your point, get in with the sales team, really understand the leadership. And it put them almost in kind of some awkward positions. And that's really where the idea for this podcast came from, is because I thought there was a point during her story where I thought, man, it sounds like the exact things that got this physician to the point where they would even be asked to do this are some of the very things that this person is now getting their hand slapped for. So as someone who has helped onboard consultant into a high level, can you share some of the things to avoid, some of the best practices, situations that you want to caution anyone about?
Yeah, well, I think what physicians may not realize is within a heavily regulated industry such as med device, med tech, there are a lot of processes and rules that need to be followed, mostly for a good reason. And they're often non-negotiable. And that, the larger the organization, the more complex and harder it is to get things done. So I think that seems to be a little of an aha moment for individuals who are used to being on the other side, where we make everything look easy, and they may know how the sausage is made, but they may not really know how it's cooked. So I think that's always a big eye opener. And as when I think about some watchouts or things to consider, as a CMO or a spokesperson or medical director, your opinions are no longer your own. They're not just your opinions. You're speaking on behalf of the organization. So what you say and how you say things matter. And that can get people into trouble. So while, as a consultant, we may have loved when you shared your honest opinion about our products and maybe calling out areas of opportunity for us and things that we may want to work on. If you're our CMO, you really need to be more careful about what you share and with whom. So I think that is probably one of the biggest learnings that individuals have had in my experience. In one of my former companies, we actually put our new chief medical officer through a type of media training. So to teach them how to give, the quotes at the conferences or, with our investor relations people, and had a real strong deep dive within our legal and regulatory businesses and departments to teach them about, off-label use and how, what they say and how they say it matters. So those are a couple areas that I think you could get, foot and mouth disease really quickly if you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, not with any ill intent, but just innocently. Like you could, Dr. Ast could be at Academy this year and having a casual conversation with a peer and, make a offhand remark about, a company that they're exploring or something. And, that could get misconstrued or, rumors happen and things like that. So you have to really be careful about what you say and who you say it to. And I think one other thing is your peers are different. So the relationships you have with other physicians in your space may change. So you may be interacting with individuals that you haven't really worked with in the past and may not have the same opportunities to work with individuals that you've been, friends or colleagues and peers with for a very long time. And so some of those relationships will change because, as you speak, you're automatically now biased towards the company that you're working for. And so your opinion might be perceived differently from others or by others because they think, you're quote unquote on the payroll. So I think there's just a couple areas. None of them are deal breakers. I think it's just an awareness, and there's a bit of hand-holding that hopefully happens for the onboarding. And oftentimes, it's just a matter of giving exposure and teaching.
And for the surgeon who's thinking about their own academic career, I think that last point's super important, right? Because there's a very big difference between being a consultant for company X, Y, and Z, and then trying to be part of the leadership or planning committee for one of the large specialty societies or something. So let's say you wanted to be on the board of the academy or of the, foot and ankle society or whatever it is. That's going to be very different than if you are an employee of a MedTech company, right? It may also be true in your own home institution where you want to be the chair of the department or take on a role within the residency, but that is open to those who are consultants within MedTech, but may be a little more restricted. Let's say you've taken on a more significant role within a med device or MedTech company. So something that really needs to be considered thoughtfully for anybody trying to take on a role like this.
Yeah, you lose your voting right within your institution just because of your relationship. So that's a really great point.
Yeah, the conflict that now suddenly exists.
Mm-hmm. It's real.
Great points. And let's kind of focus a little bit on, you talked about the media training that some new clinical leaders got with, compliance and legal along the way. Mike, you have the benefit of having some attorneys in your family. I'm sure you observed and or potentially maybe reached out for questions on, hey, in situations like this, what's the best course of action for responses or even just phrasing? And not everyone gets that, right? So you've done this, you've, gone through, you've been, appointed, to high level roles, and you've had to now suddenly be the mouthpiece representing a large organization. Speaking from just the surgeon perspective, what are some tricks that you have, if you want to make an off the cuff response, but you realize you got to rein it back, but you need to say something that you employ when you're in some of those hard situations?
Yeah, it's a super important concept. And a couple of things. Number one, I never send an email ever. I send it to Emily. She completely rewords it. She sends it back to me and then I send it out, right? So having, like you said, having that in my back pocket has always been useful. But I think what it makes you is you have to just learn to never respond right away. Just learn to take that one deep breath, think about how the response you're about to make could ever be interpreted. I think Ann was spot on earlier when she said the big problem is you can make what feels like an offhanded remark that means nothing to you, and it can affect the stock price of a company because you're representing that company. And that doesn't even have to be at the C-suite level, right? Sometimes that's just because people trust and believe that you have high levels of information about a company. But certainly, if you're in any type of a C-suite level, you want to take a deep breath, say, I'm about to answer this question. Is there any way it could be misinterpreted? And then I think there's a couple basic things. Number one, never say anything bad about the organization you are representing. This goes true for your own hospital, but certainly if you've taken on a role where you are either a high-level advisor and or a C-suite level executive, we always say like outside in the house, your family can be a mess, but outside of the house, everybody needs to think your family has it all correct. The same thing is true in your company, right? You want to tell everyone, you want to give everyone the idea at least that everything they've heard is accurate. And then you also really don't want to say anything bad about anyone else either, because that is just as bad. So even if you've heard about another implant company's issues or another executive's problem or whatever it is, remember at that point, every time you speak, you're not really speaking to your friend as yourself. That's a little bit of what you're doing, but you're always representing the organization as well. And so it's just really important to think of it from that perspective and always think, just like when you're posting something on social media today, is there any way someone can misinterpret this when they read it out of context? And what will that seem like or sound like to them? And I think you just learn to start doing that more and more and trying as often as possible to be careful with what you say.
So this is a multi-part question that I'd love to pitch out to both of you. Is there a point in a physician's career that taking on something with a big title is too soon? And if so, what does that look like? What does too soon look like?
I'll jump in. I think, the right time is going to be different for everyone. So I don't think there's, a set number of years of practice. For some people, maybe industry's more attractive than clinical practice early on. But I do think if you're going to be an effective leader in an organization, you do have to have a reputation. You need to have your reputation established, and it has to be the right time for you. So maybe you're no longer excited about your clinical practice, or, it's something that you're excited about the technology. Dr. Ast, you had mentioned before, the enthusiasm you have for the product. So you never know when that's going to come about. But I do think it's really important to have an established reputation and to be proven and have your name known by at least, your space, and have that type of background where you've shown you understand the products and the technology and the value it would have in the industry. But I do think, and it also depends on if you're planning to jump all in or if you're just planning to have this as a part-time addition to your clinical practice. So I think it depends. But I think having some sort of reputation and establishing your name and your credibility is critical.
And I think sometimes it's about the size or the scale of the role, right? If you're taking on a CMO role in a startup company that isn't that big and you spent your entire early career or even your studies before your career researching that particular topic, and you are already known on the research level as the expert in that, and you feel it's appropriate to be doing that on the side of your clinical practice, that might be fine. But if you're talking about taking on a C-suite level role in a multi-billion dollar multinational med device company, doing that too early can sort of derail some of your other plans in life, but also just maybe way too much. Like Ann said, you need the experience to actually do a good job at that role. So I don't think anybody's going to try to do that too quickly. Sometimes it's about, what do you want out of life? Do you love being a surgeon? Do you love being a clinician? And that's what you do. If that's the case, you may not want to step away to the level that some of these roles might require. But if you are at a point in your career that you are saying either, like Ann said, I'm just not that into my clinical role anymore, or you're maybe starting to slow down your clinical practice as you get through the years, then these are potentially wonderful opportunities to stay involved, to stay up to date on the latest things, to maintain professional relationships with your peers and friends, both on the surgeon and physician side, as well as on the industry side, and then maybe allow you a nice way sort of off the road in terms of your practice as a surgeon.
I had a chief medical officer that I had the privilege of working with for over a decade. And he had always said, when people asked him, like, why would you leave your practice? Because he was a very established physician who was the president of his and ran a very large private practice. And he said he really decided to come to industry. He wasn't at the end of his career by any means, but he knew that if he came into, a large organization, that he would be able to impact more patients. And so it was really about scale for him. He kind of felt like, I've had a really big impact in my area, but now he's able to affect people around the globe with his knowledge and expertise. And so I thought that was really interesting, which, it kind of comes back to the why. So his why was, I want to help more people. I want to have that experience. Others may be different, but I think that's a very legitimate reason to want to leave your practice and dive into a new adventure.
That makes sense. Do most physicians stop their clinical practice when they take on a C-suite level role at a company?
At a big company, yes. At a big company, for the most part, you may still do some clinical research, but at smaller companies, typically no. That's my experience.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, most of the smaller companies that have these types of roles, they're relatively part-time. People do them, like many surgeons, essentially as a consulting type thing, where they may do it a couple hours a week, or they may do it a couple days a month, or whatever it is, but most continue their clinical practice. Those who've taken on these very large roles at the very large companies generally can't do that and maintain a clinical practice in any real way, or if they do, oftentimes struggle to find that balance. And I know certainly people like to try to achieve that balance between clinical practice and the responsibilities of one of these more high levels executive roles, but it can be really challenging. So it would take the right personality to make it successful.
Well, and I will also say another avenue to start that type of leadership role is being on these smaller companies' scientific advisory boards or their board of directors. That's, you're in theory part of their leadership team. But if it's not an organization that is large enough or has the full need of a CMO, they may have a small group of scientific advisors or clinical advisors. And that's another avenue where you would absolutely not be leaving your clinical practice, but you get that experience and you get that exposure working in industry that I would think would be invaluable.
That makes sense. So let's talk about the opportunity cost, because there's a lot of great things that come from it. Besides having to run everything you write and say by a lawyer first, what are the things that you give up? First, we'll go to Mike, and then Ann. What are some of the things, as you've had conversations with people who have been in these roles for a while, and they look back, what have they given up to be able to take something like this on?
I think firstly, you give up time, and that is okay depending on what you're trying to do. The next thing you give up are other opportunities. So let's say you used to do consulting for a couple different companies. You had sort of the very large company you consulted with, but then maybe some small companies and some startup companies. In general, if you're going to take on one of these larger roles within a big organization, that's going to be the end of all of those other opportunities, which is, again, it's okay. It's just what it's required to be able to get to that level with the single company. And then, as we alluded to earlier, depending on how big the company is or what type of conflicts of interest may arise from it, you may be giving up some potential academic opportunities. You may be giving up potential opportunities that find your new role to be too large of a conflict of interest for some of these other things, whether they're specialty societies or roles within your organization or roles within larger orthopedic groups.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that from my former CMOs and my CMOs. I will also say that, one individual, he loved it when we would put him in a lab and let him try out the new technology like we do with our consultants, because he doesn't get the opportunity to use that anymore. So because, if you give up your clinical practice, you don't get to use the new tools every day. You don't get to, I don't want to say play with, but you don't get to play with the cool technology that you're helping to develop. So, for him, that was a treasure to be able to go in and go into an animal lab or a cadaver lab and be able to play with it and do some implants. And not have that patient connection was also something that they missed. Not everyone loves the patient connection, but having that, one-on-one time with some of your patients, that was definitely something you would give up. But I think the funniest for me was you lose that white glove treatment you receive when you're a consultant or a customer with an organization. Suddenly you're one of them. So, there might not be a car waiting for you at the airport anymore. You might have to call an Uber, little things like that. But it was, I'm making a joke, but it is true that you do lose that feeling of being, not that you're not feeling special, but you lose that white glove service and treatment because you are now, in the trenches with them, and you have to actually provide that white glove treatment, which is not always easy for some people.
Well, thank you, Ann, Mike. This has been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure our listeners got a ton of great insight. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Ast and Ann Roen, please check out their bios in the show notes. Thank you both.
Thanks so much, Marnie. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Marnie. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Connect to Develop. You can find more interviews and Marnie's Minutes on my YouTube channel at Marney Reid Presents.